Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Bow, 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 bow.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Habari Gani. This is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for this fund drive Saturday, December 6, 2025. We commence today's program with our ancestor Didan Kamati in the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. This hour, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Compton's very own Dr. Jarvis Givens, Professor of Education and African American Studies at Harvard University and author of the new book, American Grammar, Race, Education, and the Building of a Nation. And later in the hour, we'll hear an extended prison radio commentary from none other than Mumia Abu-Jamal on Palestine Amid Colonial War. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Quincy Jones, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Mutabaruka and D-Merge, Mos Def, Macklemore, Immortal Technique, and more. We are in Fund Drive, so now Gary Baca is going to let you know about what we're offering up as premiums for this hour, first with bassist Marcus Miller tickets. So enjoy some of his music coming up next, and as always we stand ready for revolution. Take it away, Gary.
818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. We are offering tickets to go see Marcus Miller for Sunday night at 9 p.m. So this is tomorrow at Catalina's Bar and Grill in Hollywood on Sunset Boulevard, home of the $8 parking. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK, extension 2. Let them know that you want to see bassist Marcus Miller, who has played with Miles Davis, Herbie Hancock, George Duke, Lee Ritenour, and Luther Vandross. He was actually the producer and arranger, along with Nat Adderley and Luther Vandross, a Grammy Award-winning bassist, and he'll be at Catalina's Bar and Grill coming up tomorrow, Sunday, at 9 p.m. So, folks, we're asking you to go to your phone and pledge your support for Freedom Now, that we can keep this show on the air, the resources we need. This is a show that gives you those resources, and you're just a little bit smarter and ready for the revolution. 818-985-KPFK, 818-985-KPFK, extension 2. And it's very important that we raise the funds for KPFK because we are listener-sponsored radio. It's because of you that we exist. And if we don't have you, then we will go away because we are dependent on listeners like yourself. We've been around since 1959. And so why are we so important? Because we covered the wars. We covered the atrocities. We covered all the presidents since 1959 right here in Los Angeles. So that's why people keep us alive. That's why people pledge, because they get news like no other place. It's right here only on KPFK 90.7 FM Los Angeles. You may tune out, you may tune back in, but if you're back with us, thank you. And if you can, pledge your support for this radio program, for this show, for this station, that we can stay on the air and be relevant. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. It costs approximately almost $10,000 a month to keep the transmitter going and keep our lights on, keep the computers going. We've had some trouble in the past with our transmitter, and we have asked for your support in helping us, and you have responded. So we continue to work on the transmitter, which has been around since 1959, and we also keep shows like Democracy Now!, Tom Hartman, Law and Disorder, Background Briefing, all on KPFK. So pledge now at 818-985-5735. Back to Freedom Now.
Watch out, there are racists about me. Telling no, watch out, there are racists about. Watch out, there are racists about me. Telling no, watch out, there are racists about them. In the east, them in the west, them in the north, them in the south, them over the road, them down the lane, and them they round about. And out of this was them just a crawl out, and them talking the excrement from out of them out. When them break down the wall, them in a Germany, the ones from the gate, and them they round about. And out of this was them just a crawl out, and them talking the excrement from out of them out. When them break down the wall, them in a Germany, Europe come together in a 92. Good for them, but me don't know about me and you. Like the skinhead them a come true, but they say we not run. Them the deals done. Back off.
Hotep, this is Brother Dion with the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for this week of December 5th. On December 5th, 1958, Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, the anti-colonial leader and first Prime Minister of Ghana, convenes the All-African People Conference. This conference fulfills Nkrumah's inaugural pledge that the independence of Ghana means nothing as long as African people anywhere were oppressed. The conference objective was globally to coordinate the decolonization and the de-neocolonization of Africa and African people worldwide. Within a 10-year period, over 70% of African countries gained independence from colonialism. December 6, 1961, Frantz Fanon, Pan-Africanist, Caribbean-born, French-educated staff psychologist for the French Colonial Army's Division of Interrogations in Algiers, dies. Frantz Fanon committed class suicide and became a member of the National Liberation Front of Algeria and a prolific writer on the psychology of colonialism. His most famous book, The Wretched of the Earth, became the Bible of the psychology of the oppressed and oppressor, as well as the books Black Skins, White Masks. December 6, 1990, Melchora Aquino, revolutionary Filipino independence activist, crosses over. She was imprisoned for providing weapons, storage, and communications to the anti-Spanish resistance forces seeking to gain independence from Spanish colonial rule of the Philippines. December 7th, 1987, the Palestinian Intifada, national uprising, begins in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip, heralding another phase in the decolonization struggle of the Palestinians against the Israeli settler colony called Israel. December 7th, 1971, Libya, under the revolutionary leadership of Muammar Gaddafi, nationalizes the oil fields controlled by British Petroleum. December 8th, 1995, Sister Toni Cade Bambara crosses over to the ancestor world. Toni stated, "It is a duty, it is the responsibility of the writer to represent an oppressed people, to make revolution irresistible." Toni, an African born in America, she's a revolutionary socialist, Pan-Africanist, author, and lecturer. December 9th, 1961, Tanganyika gains independence in Mwalimu Nyerere under the banner of socialism and unites with the African island of Zanzibar, creating Tanzania in one of the many efforts of building a United States of Africa. December 11th, 1895, Dolores Imbaru, nicknamed La Pasonera, quotes, "Better to die on your feet than on your knees. They shall not pass." The most famous and important Spanish communist of the 20th century, who founded the Spanish Communist Party in 1920, as well as organized miners, and was a leader in the Spanish Civil War against the fascist Franco dictatorship. December 10th, 1956, a movement for the liberation of Angola is founded and leads the people of Angola in a fierce armed war against Portuguese colonialism and against the racist South African regime and the United States' effort to recolonize Angola. Cuba provides military support to assist Angola in driving back U.S.-backed racist South African troops. December 12th, 1977, the Geneva Convention was revised and the rules of war signed, giving guerrillas the same rights as uniformed soldiers during the war. This has been the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. Any comments, inputs, whatever, please contact us at freedomnow@kpfk.org. And as always, we say, Amandala await to, Amandala await to, Amandala await to.
You are listening to Freedom Now, right here on KPFK 90.7 FM Los Angeles. I'm Gary Baca. I want to ask you to go to your phones and support Freedom Now on KPFK. 818-985-5735 is the number to call, extension 2, to support KPFK in our endeavors, to get the word out, to let people know truth to power and what's going on in the Middle East, Gaza, Minneapolis, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, locally, right here. Freedom Now is a Pan-African internationalist world affairs program supporting all indigenous and oppressed peoples worldwide. Hey, what more can we say, right? This is a show that is much needed and is a resource. 818-985-5735 to pledge at any amount, $25, $50, $75, whatever you can do to support Freedom Now. Ready for the revolution? Listen in every Saturday at 11 a.m. 818-985-5735. Freedom Now supports the right for self-determination, to provide another point of view devoid of mainstream media. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Freedom Now is a anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist program covering the Pan-African diaspora and struggles of oppressed peoples worldwide. 818-985-5735. This is what this show is all about. We have the historian Gerald Horne, who talks about the history of America, all mixed into a global music mix. Freedom Now also highlights a Los Angeles jazz musician every week. But we have the prolific author, professor, historian of African Studies, Dr. Gerald Horne. Freedom Now. Please call and support this show that we can keep this show on the air. If you're a fan, you listen, you want to support these folks and feel close to them, like family, like you listen every Saturday, call now at 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK, and pledge at any amount, $25, $50, $75, whatever you can afford, but every dollar counts. 818-985-5735. You are listening to Freedom Now, a Pan-African internationalist world affairs program. 818-985-5735 with Dr. Gerald Horne and our sister from another Mr. Tej, who co-produces the show and says, always, we stand ready for revolution.
Thank you, Brother Gary. And now we go to our interview with Dr. Jarvis Givens.
For KPFK Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Jarvis Givens, Professor of Education and African American Studies at Harvard University of Massachusetts, and author of the book American Grammar, Race, Education, and the Building of a Nation. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Jarvis Givens.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So before we get into the book, could you tell us a bit about your upbringing in Compton in the Southland? Beyond family, what were your influences? For example, teachers, perhaps public library, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for asking that question. I grew up in Compton, California. Both of my parents, my mother and father, were both also raised in Compton and also Long Beach when it comes to my father. But I was primarily raised by my grandmother, my mother's mother, so my maternal grandmother, in the same house that my mother was raised in Compton. Attended schools in Compton. I actually attended a really small Black parochial school right behind Compton High called St. Timothy's Episcopal Day School that was originally created when Compton was a majority white city. But then, as you know, you're very familiar when it comes to your work, and a lot of other folks are familiar that what happens with white flight in the mid 20th century. Black folks moved into the city and appropriated what was once this all-white Episcopalian school. And by the time I got there in the 1990s, it was run by Black teachers. There were majority Black students, and it was really a thriving Black educational environment where educational achievement and Black identity were went hand in hand with one another. And so I would definitely say that my family was always supportive of me and my educational pursuits, but I also benefited from a very unusual educational experience in the city of Compton because of that school that I attended.
Does that school that you attended still exist in the same shape and form that existed when you were growing up?
No, the school is no longer there. Some years after I graduated from 8th grade, it was a preschool through 8th grade institution. I went to a public high school, that's California, King Drew. And by the time I graduated high school, actually, I think the student population started to decline in terms of numbers, and gradually over time, the school just eventually phased out. So to my knowledge, the school is no longer in operation. I know that at one point they had something like a child care facility on the school grounds, but it's not active as the K through 8 school that I attended.
Now, to get to the book, American Grammar, why did you produce this book?
Yeah, I first began with questions that led to American Grammar, in part because I was frustrated. One, that I found that a lot of people would make false equivalencies between the racialized experiences that Black people in the context of the U.S. had in relationship to education with other racialized minority groups in the U.S. And even though, various groups had very long histories of racial oppression when it came to education, I always knew that they were distinct in kind. And so I initially wanted to set out to write this book to help clarify, what it means to kind of take race and the history of racial oppression seriously without conflating experiences. And so I wanted to write a book that was, doing a comparative history of Black and Native education. But then that led me to start asking some deeper structural questions that was beyond just kind of comparing Black and Native educational histories in the U.S., but actually talking about how the experiences of racial domination that Black and Native people experienced in early American education was actually also directly related to the early development and funding of even white education. So essentially, it became a book that moved beyond just trying to kind of do some comparative work about the distinct histories of Black and Native education to a book that was looking at how Black and Native experiences were central to the development of U.S. education overall. And that's where American Grammar came from. And it kind of evolved in that way.
Speaking of education of the indigenous, there has been quite a bit in the news lately about these notorious boarding schools that were used to teach, in inverted commas, the indigenous population. What do you have to say about that story?
Yeah, A lot of the work that has been done to uncover the history of Native American boarding schools, these were schools that were created both by missionary organizations, but also supported by uh, political leaders in the context of the U.S. Um, a lot of that work has been really, really important in terms of uncovering the kind of efforts to erase indigenous cultures in those schools, but also the extreme experiences of violence that Native students experienced. But one of the things that I've really tried to drive home in this book is that the story of, cultural genocide or assimilation that's typically used to talk about the educational aims of these Native boarding schools is partially true, but also misses a larger part of the story, which is one of the things that I argue is that these efforts by U.S. officials to educate Native people was also an extension of the American Indian Wars. So it's not just about efforts to erase Native culture, but it's also an investment in Native American boarding schools and Native education policy by government actors because they're seen as a cheaper alternative to costly wars. They're seen as an opportunity to break up certain kinds of cultural formations in Native communities that were seen as impediments to national expansion. And this is why, for instance, in the book, I demonstrate how a lot of the early government funding that's flowing into missionary associations that are establishing these schools are coming directly from the U.S. Department of War. So, for instance, in the book, I talk about the Civilization Fund Act of 1819 that Congress passed, where there was funding in the federal budget on an annual basis set aside for quote unquote civilizing Native tribes on the American front in the American frontier. And this funding was administered by the U.S. Secretary of War. So one of the things that I really try to drive home in the book is that these Native boarding schools, not just a array of cultures, but it's actually serving a very specific set of political and economic aims for the U.S. Nation as it's yet forming, right? This is very early in the decades following American independence that some of these efforts are put in place. And many of them are also carryovers from the colonial period as well when we think about very, very early models of Native boarding schools and mission schools targeting Native communities.
Were there Native boarding schools in California?
Absolutely. Yeah, there were absolutely boarding schools that become established in California. And even outside of kind of boarding schools that were established in California, many of the boarding schools that are established after, let's say, 1870, there's a lot of emphasis on shipping Native students away from their tribal communities to kind of distant locations. So you have people who might have been from kind of tribes that might be on the kind of western part of the kind of North America or the U.S. that are being sent to boarding schools in other locations, in part because there's an interest in disrupting tribal identity. And so oftentimes there are students that were sent to locations that were far out of reach from their tribal communities to also prevent students from running away, things like that. But there were absolutely boarding schools in California as well.
You also suggest that present conflicts within the field of education today are not just culture wars. For example, in the state of Texas, you've had the passage of SB 237, which, if implemented altogether, will severely circumscribe the teaching of African American history, for example. What do you mean when you suggest that these are not just culture war issues?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I'm saying is, what we teach when it comes to history is not just a matter of, our cultural identities, but it has political and economic implications as well. I think one of the, how we tell the story about the histories of racial harm in this country has implications for instance, decisions that people make when it comes to policy about how to try and rectify or to address certain harms that we're still living with today. And so, in my mind, when we have a lot of the debates around how we teach about race and the history of racial inequality in schools, it's not just a matter of culture, but I think there are a lot of people who became uncomfortable with certain demands that people have been making, having learned more information about some of the unpleasant histories when it comes to our country or when it comes to certain harms of particular communities. Because when you study, for instance, the history of slavery, the history of redlining, the history of policing and various forms of structural inequality, it naturally leads people to make decisions about certain things that need to be done in order to try and correct some of those past injustices. And so the debates that we see happening right now, I don't think that it's only a question of culture, right? But and not to say that it's when something being about culture is not also about political and economic factors. But I'm just trying to press home the fact that the issues around race when it comes to schools have always had deep ties to broader forces when it comes to the politics and economic formation of our society. And I see this current iteration of debates around race in schooling to also be about those larger concerns about politics and economics as well.
Speaking of which, how did profits from enslavement of Africans and seizure of the land of the indigenous serve to underwrite education and educational opportunities for the Euro-American majority?
Yeah, this was one of the big things that came up for me in writing the book. When I started to go back to the very beginning of public school funding in the U.S., when I was reading a lot of the secondary literature, all of the history of education from the early U.S., there was a lot of efforts to talk about how early school funds, whether it be in New York, whether it be in Georgia, whether it be in Massachusetts, so on and so forth, were established by selling public lands or federal lands to establish literary funds or to establish common school funds in various states. And a lot of these early scholars just took for granted this idea of quote unquote public lands. And so what I decided to do was to do a bit more digging to figure out the history behind these specific lands that were being used to establish funding for public education in the colonies that became states immediately after American independence, and then new states that became added to the U.S. as time went on. And time and time again, we see very clear links between the dispossession of native land in various territories with the selling of that land in order to establish public school funding. But also the land ordinance of 1785 and also the land ordinance of 1787 are also really important here, because in those ordinances is a specified process for how new townships and ultimately new states are to be to the Union. And these laws and this kind of framework for establishing new states as America continues to expand, they carve out what they call the 16th section of land to be designated for public schools, right, of every new township. So essentially with the land ordinance of 1787, as it's imagining continued expansion, right, they created this grid, this 16 by 16 grid that was to be mapped on to every new township, where public education is being baked into the process of U.S. expansion. And U.S. expansion is obviously also being imagined through the kind of continued dispossession of Native people. There's a direct relationship between Native land dispossession and the early establishment of public school funds. So that's the part there. And there are various other kind of intricate stories that go beyond the land ordinances and those examples that I just gave. But then when we come to the question of slavery, when we think about especially the establishment of public school funding in the South, many of the early school funds and literary funds, whether it be in Virginia, whether it be in places like Georgia or Alabama, are established through property taxes. Funds are and revenue is generated through property taxes. And we know, for instance, even in places like Georgia, by the kind of, by 1840, nearly 50% of the state's tax revenue is coming from taxing, property of enslaved people as property. It's coming from slave taxes. That's directly being funneled into funds that's being established for the purposes of creating more common school education opportunities in the state. And even in the places that had abolished slavery by the, when it comes to the antebellum period, I give examples like, for instance, New York, where the literary fund or the school fund in the state of New York is being invested in various banks, is, purchasing investment bonds in order to grow the wealth and the funding for education in that state. And they're investing in banks that have direct ties to the slave trade, right? So these school funds are growing in the funding that they have because of their direct partnerships with banks that are in the South, but also these banks' direct ties to slave trafficking.
To expand upon your latter response, talk to us about how anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity help to shape and form an overall U.S. identity.
Yeah, one of the things that I really emphasize in the book is that, education becomes a major site where the early quote unquote founding fathers are working to construct a distinctly American identity. And that American identity becomes expressed in very clear racial terms. These schools that are being created to create a common experience and a common identity is overwhelmingly meant to support a national identity that is white, Protestant, and English speaking. And that identity is created and formed in schools as new students are coming into being and being socialized in society. And these very schools are being created and expanding through the direct dispossession of Black and Native people, right? In a structural way. When we think about that experience that I just talked about in terms of public school funding being tied to Native dispossession and slavery. But beyond that, I also show in the book how the national identity is formed through anti-Black and anti-Indigenous ideas through the curriculum itself. When we look at ideas in history books, when we look at ideas that are expressed in geography books and American literature that are being taught in American education in the 19th century, we see very clear racial themes, ideas that are being expressed about Native people that are used to justify the continued dispossession of Native people. And similarly, anti-Black ideas when it comes to the treatment of Black people in curriculum, or sometimes just the complete exclusion of Black people when it's inconvenient to talk about matters such as slavery, colonialism, et cetera, et cetera. But I also give examples even when it comes to matters such as mathematics, right? I look at, for instance, math textbooks in the antebellum period that are, in word problems that are preparing young white students on how to be effective property owners, right? And that means how do you count and make certain kind of arithmetic assessments when it comes to, one's estate if you own slaves just as much as you own property, right? So I give examples about even how racial themes are informing the ideas around mathematics and science that are developing in the 19th century as well, that's being offered as the curriculum to students that are attending schooling in the U.S.
Finally, Jarvis Givens, Professor of Education and African American Studies at Harvard University, author of the book American Grammar. Your next book is on Black History Month. Give us a foretaste of what we should be expecting.
Absolutely. Yeah, I decided to write this book about the 100-year journey of Black History Month because February 2026 will be the 100th anniversary since the first Negro History Week celebration in February 1926, when Negro History Week was created by Carter G. Woodson and spread across the country in partnership with Black community institutions and African American teachers. So this is the book that's about honoring the legacy of Black History Month, but also talking about why it's important for communities to pull our approaches to thinking about Black commemorative practices when it comes to history and historical preservation in this moment and time where we see attacks on critical interpretations of history all around us, especially attacks on critical interpretations of Black history when we think about the executive order passed by President Trump this past year, but also various laws across states in the U.S. that are meant to restrict what can and cannot be taught about history in classrooms. So I'm using the anniversary of Black History Month in 2026 as an opportunity to talk about the important organizing traditions and intellectual traditions that led to the emergence of Negro History Week to begin with, and ultimately Black History Month, and to talk about what it might mean for communities to kind of recommit our collective selves to the kind of study, preservation, and teaching of difficult truths about the past, but also teaching the kind of beautiful aspects of our history that are also inspiring for people and communities that are trying to organize against the kind of current threats and difficult times that we're experiencing right now.
Well, Professor Givens, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Absolutely. Thank you for your time.
818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. We are offering tickets to go see Marcus Miller for Sunday night at 9 p.m. So this is tomorrow at Catalina's Bar and Grill in Hollywood on Sunset Boulevard, home of the $8 parking. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK, extension 2. Let them know that you want to see bassist Marcus Miller, who has played with Miles Davis, Herbie Hancock, George Duke, Lee Ritenour, and Luther Vandross. He was actually the producer and arranger, along with Nat Adderley and Luther Vandross, a Grammy Award-winning bassist, and he'll be at Catalina's Bar and Grill coming up tomorrow, Sunday, at 9 p.m. So, folks, we're asking you to go to your phone and pledge your support for Freedom Now, that we can keep this show on the air, the resources we need. This is a show that gives you those resources, and you're just a little bit smarter and ready for the revolution. 818-985-KPFK, 818-985-KPFK, extension 2. And it's very important that we raise the funds for KPFK because we are listener-sponsored radio. It's because of you that we exist. And if we don't have you, then we will go away because we are dependent on listeners like yourself. We've been around since 1959. And so why are we so important? Because we covered the wars. We covered the atrocities. We covered all the presidents since 1959 right here in Los Angeles. So that's why people keep us alive. That's why people pledge, because they get news like no other place. It's right here only on KPFK 90.7 FM Los Angeles. You may tune out, you may tune back in, but if you're back with us, thank you. And if you can, pledge your support for this radio program, for this show, for this station, that we can stay on the air and be relevant. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. It costs approximately almost $10,000 a month to keep the transmitter going and keep our lights on, keep the computers going. We've had some trouble in the past with our transmitter, and we have asked for your support in helping us, and you have responded. So we continue to work on the transmitter, which has been around since 1959, and we also keep shows like Democracy Now!, Tom Hartman, Law and Disorder, Background Briefing, all on KPFK. So pledge now at 818-985-5735. Back to Freedom Now.
And now we go to a December 3rd, 2025 prison radio commentary by political prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal on Palestine Amid Colonial War. And just like in our African drumbeat historical calendar earlier this hour with our ancestor Didan Kamati, you'll hear about Frantz Fanon and, of course, Palestine.
Palestine amid imperial colonial war. I greet you all, especially Sister Rabab, who invited me to join you, all of you, several weeks ago. So I greet you all. Marhaba. When we think of Palestine today, our minds fly naturally to the last few years of carnage that has cost, at the very least, 70,000 lives, those of men, women, and children, and over 90% of Palestinian buildings and structures in Gaza destroyed by Israeli and U.S. bombs. But I think it important to turn our eyes away and turn back the clock and calendar almost 100 years ago, when the British gave its imprimatur to land transfers from Arabs to Jewish immigrants from Europe. When the British Empire held lands under its League of Nations trusteeship, the forerunner to the United Nations. There we see the imperial beginnings to this crisis to come. On November 2nd, 1917, Arthur James Balfour, the Earl of Balfour, wrote a letter to Lionel Walter, Lord Rothschild, the following. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. You've been listening to what has been called the Balfour Declaration of 1917. At the time, Britain held sway over one of the largest empires on earth, with lands in North America, Africa, and Asia, not to mention vast holdings scattered throughout the seas, like islands. Does it not really surprise us that they offered not a foot of land in Europe? From that day to this, Palestinian lands have been stolen, their holdings denied, and their farmlands whittled away. It is impossible to look at this as anything other than an imperial and neo-colonial conspiracy designed to prejudice the rights of the Palestinian people. How could Israel violate international law for almost a century with the United Nations looking the other way? This happens because we misunderstand the role really played by the UN, the successor to the failed League of Nations. Fortunately, Frantz Fanon, in his Toward the African Revolution, explains, we can say that two mistakes were simultaneously committed by the Africans. First of all, by Lumumba himself, when he asked for the intervention of the UN. The UN has never been capable of validly settling a single one of the problems raised before the conscience of man by colonialism. And every time it has intervened, it was in order to come concretely to the rescue of the colonial power of the oppressing country. That's Fanon. Fanon, this man whose mind pierced into the very core of reality, understood the central nature of the UN and wrote as follows: in reality, the UN is the legal card used by the imperialist interests when the card of brute force has failed. Fanon wrote these insights in the wake of the betrayal and assassination of Congolese leader Patrice Lumumba. Lumumba's first great mistake, he noted, was his trust in the West and the UN. It cost him not only his life, but the collective lives and futures of the people of the Congo. We ponder these developments in light of the creeping occupation of Palestine and its territories, itself a violation of international law, as well as the emergence of Israel as a de facto regional hegemon in the Middle East. Some have likened the Zionist state to an aircraft carrier. Think of that. A weapon of war, indeed, a weapon of mass destruction in the region. The 1,000 plus years of European oppression of Jews is being paid by Arabs in Palestine. For Europe is the site of repeated Jewish expulsion, traumatization, and, as the German experience has shown us, genocidal destruction of Jews en masse. These historical experiences have created an intense otherness in Jewish consciousness that makes the extreme seem perfectly normal, for extremity has become normalized. This means that in order to mitigate its own otherness, the Jewish state had to make the leap from former British colony to an entity which exercised colonial power, which is to say, it had to act like a European power. How was this done? They had to treat the Palestinians, the indigenous people of the land, as others. This they have done since, indeed before, the establishment of Israel in 1948. I suggest here that much of the psychological energy fueling Israel is a hunger to really become something that it never was in over a millennia in Europe, European. Much of that energy has been projected upon the Palestinians rather than their true historical enemies, Europeans. State power, supported by the purchase and manufacture of weaponry, has given it the ability to make psychological energy into reality in the real world today. Cameroonian scholar Attile Mbembe, in his now classic work, Necropolitics, examines the underlying conflicts between states and colonies thusly. Colonies are similar to frontiers inhabited by quote-unquote savages. Colonies are not organized as a state form and do not create a human world. The armies do not form a distinct entity, and their wars are not wars between regular armies. They do not imply the mobilization of sovereign subjects, what are called citizens, who respect each other as enemies. They do not establish a distinction between combatants and non-combatants, or, again, between an enemy and a criminal. Concluding peace with them is thus impossible. In sum, colonies are zones in which war and disorder, internal and external, figures of the political stand side by side or alternate with each other. The colony is thus the site par excellence where controls and juridical control and guarantees of judicial order can be suspended. The zone where the violence of the state of exception is deemed to operate in the service of quote-unquote civilization. Mbembe, page 77. What we see in Mbembe's citation is the colonization, otherization, and depersonalization of Palestinians, even as the state eats and encroaches on indigenous lands of Palestinian people. The recent war against Hamas was, in fact, a war against Palestinians, as evinced by the death of some 70,000 souls in Gaza. That colonial versus the colonized dialectic discussed by Mbembe is the roadmap of a territorialization of oppression. For nearly a century, Palestine has been under attack. They are still under attack, just by more violent means today. They struggle on, as they must do, even as their present life is truly the wretched of the earth. And speaking of Fanon's masterwork, the only solution to such a state is ceaseless struggle against the colonizer until it is no more. For only then can a new, independent nation be born to give voice and place to the wretched of the earth. With love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu-Jamal. Thank you.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
You've just heard a December 3rd, 2025 prison radio commentary by political prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal on Palestine Amid Colonial War. And now, Gary Baca is going to give our last pitch for this Freedom Now hour.
Here's our last pitch-ditch effort to ask you to go to your phones and pledge your support for this program, Freedom Now. We have to keep this show on the air as well as many other shows that are here. It's a need, it's a resource, and KPFK is here. You know, we have to deal with ICE, we have to deal with this president and this administration, but you know what? We're here, and we're going to do it. We're going to be right here with you. Shows like Carrie Harrison, Files, and you got Sonali Kohatkar, you got Democracy Now!, Tom Hartman. All these shows have a meaning and a purpose, is to inform us. And you know, they don't want us to know what's going on. They want you to think about what's going on in space. Right now, there's a big thing where, we're releasing the files of the space aliens. How about release the Epstein files? 818-985-5735, because they don't want us to know how corrupt they are, these billionaires. 818-985-5735. We do have Spider, the Epstein book, the Epstein files. That's for a $100 donation. Call the phone room and say, you know what, I want that book, The Spider, Jeffrey Epstein. 818-985-5735. We're also offering the Tom Hartman book, which is a $100 donation. His latest book, it's all about the administration and the president, and I think it's for good reading, because we really need to know what our future holds. Also, you can get the Chris Hedges book for a $120 donation to the station. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. That's the number to call. And let the phone room know that you want to get any one of those books, or just want to pledge your support for Freedom Now, which would be much appreciated. 818-985-5735, or pledge online at kpfk.org. It does take a lot of money to keep this radio station going. As I mentioned, the transmitter alone is just $10,000 a month. So what we do is we save the money that we get from all your donations at this end of the year fund drive, so that way we can spend money on our expenses in January and February and March. So that way we don't have to go to fund drive right away. You know, we don't spend everything all in 1 month. We extend it for about 3 months, and we want to remain listener sponsored, no ads, no commercials, commercial free. And that way we don't have to deal with the corporations telling us what we can and cannot do. So folks, go to your phone now and pledge your support for this radio station. Get yourself a tote bag, a KPFK t-shirt with the KPFK logo. This is a great gift for young people, friends. Everybody wants a t-shirt from the radio station, and it has a big microphone on it, and you can pledge at the $60 level for that, and that way some of your friends could be our walking billboards. We can get the word out and let people know how important KPFK is. We're trying to get as many listeners as we can in Southern California, but right now we're looking for 500 new subscribers, new sustainers. 818-985-5735, looking for sustainers that can pledge $10 a month, $20 a month, $40 a month, or even $100 a month for 6 months. That's $600, or $10 a month for 6 months. $60. Hey, you can do that, right? 818-985-5735. Subscribe. Become a subscriber to this radio station, so that way you're part of the family. So I'm going to give out the number one more time before we get out of here. I'm sure you folks have enjoyed today's show of Freedom Now. Once again, the number is 818-985-5735. That's 818-985-KPFK, or online at kpfk.org.
Thank you, Brother Gary Baca, and thank you to all who donated this hour to help keep Freedom Now on the air and the lights on in our building. Again, the number to call is 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. And we want to thank our guest, Dr. Jarvis Givens. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Brother Brandon, our board op Sylvester Rivers. Special shout out to Gary Baca and all those who made today's program possible. Please stay tuned for more Fund Drive programming coming up next here on KPFK. Signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage. And until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.